of participants continuing to grow, so I will wait. And I take the opportunity to thank you very much for your participation. Welcome to the IDDRI of the webinar. We'll start in a second. Okay, let's start, and I'm sure other people will join. So welcome to everyone, and thank you very much for joining this webinar organized by IDDRI and the French Biodiversity Agency. So as you know, the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, also called the Kunming-Montreal Agreement, was adopted last December by the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this agreement is extremely important because it provides basically a roadmap for the international community to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity. And IDDRI has commented on this agreement on various occasions, so I will not enter into too many details, but let's just note that this agreement contains several objectives and targets covering the ocean and coast, and basically aim at transforming the way these ecosystems are managed. And this includes, for instance, Target 2 on the restoration of at least 30% of degraded ecosystem. Target 3, of course, with this flagship provision establishing the 30 by 30. Targets 5 and 10 that deals with the sustainable management of fisheries resources. And of course, other targets that are extremely important for the ocean, such as those related to pesticide risk reduction or to harmful subsidies. So today, we will discuss the implementation of this provision in the marine environment, and we will focus on two specific challenges. First, the integration of the Kunming-Montreal Agreement into intergovernmental organizations that have a mandate on the marine environment. And then we'll discuss also the implementation of this agreement in the ICES, raising the question of its articulation with the recently adopted ICES treaty. But before we formally start, let me give the floor to Cyrille Barnerias from the French Biodiversity Agency for a few words of introduction. Cyrille, please.
Merci, Julien. Hello, everyone. Yes, and thank you also, Julien and Karine, for organizing this webinar. I'm very happy that we have the opportunity to discuss today about this topic on how we're going to move now forward to during the coming years, as the French Biodiversity Agency is an implementing agency of biodiversity agreements in France, and we also have the opportunity to cooperate with other stakeholders as colleagues in Costa Rica and other countries. So we are also very interested on the recommendation and the thoughts that our speaker will share with us today. And I also would like to point that it's all the more important as we have on our mind and in line the UN Ocean Conference that France will co-organize with Costa Rica in 24 in Costa Rica, in 25 June in Nice, south of France. Of course, if it's not already the case, please check that date in your calendar, June 25. And so with no further ado, I will let Phenia Marras, is also working at the French Biodiversity Agency in my team, to lead the discussion on the first part of this webinar. Phenia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Merci Cyrille, merci Julien. Hello everybody, I'm Phenia Marras from the French Biodiversity Agency. I'm marine advisor and in charge of international cooperation and partnerships. So I am in charge to chair the session on integrating the Global Biodiversity Framework into intergovernmental marine-related organizations. What are the issues and challenges? And we will have some concrete examples on how to be implemented in the Mediterranean, from Asia and also from the Northeast Atlantic Ocean. So I would like to invite the first speaker, Mr. Gabino Gonzalez Deogracia, from the Barcelona Convention Secretariat, to take the floor.
Thank you very much for inviting the Barcelona Convention to this event. So I will share my screen, hopefully. Give me a second.
While you are sharing your screen, let me please remind you that you can, during the presentations, you have a pictogram with questions and answers. So please use this room to list your questions, and with support from Julien and me, we will take some time to present your questions to the speakers. Sorry, the floor is yours again.
Thank you very much. So allow me to welcome everyone to this event. Thank you for joining. I will give you a short presentation indicating the integration of the GBF into the Barcelona Convention. And for those who are not familiar with the Barcelona Convention, allow me to give a brief introduction, starting with the establishment of the Mediterranean Action Plan in 1977, which was the first regional seas program of the United Nations Environment Programme as an institutional framework for cooperation to address common challenges of the Mediterranean marine environment. The following year, in 1976, a convention for the protection of the marine environment and coastal region of the Mediterranean was adopted and further amended in 1995. Today, the contracting party to this convention include the 21 Mediterranean coastal states, as well as the European Union, and it allows countries to work together, but also provides legally binding instruments to protect the coastal, the marine environment and the coastal region of the Mediterranean region, including 7 protocols dealing with specific topics, going from dumping to prevention and emergency pollution from ships, land-based pollution, offshore, hazardous waste, and as well as integrated coastal zone management. But for the interest of this forum, of this webinar, my presentation will focus more on the work which is done by the Barcelona Convention on the protocol on specially protected area and biological diversity in the Mediterranean. Actually, the setup for the Barcelona Convention is through the coordinating unit based in Athens, which coordinate the work of 6 regional activity centers and the MedPol program, addressing the protocol referred earlier and other challenges for the region. The Specially Protected Area Regional Activity Center based in Tunisia is the one addressing the SPA and biodiversity protocol I referred earlier. So the SPARAC is, as I mentioned, is based in Tunisia and supports the Mediterranean countries in a number of activities, notably in setting up inventories and mapping, including invasive species or endangered species. They carry out also project or activities on research and development, and coordinates conservation program. And throughout those processes, they also supports the implementation of the integrated monitoring and assessment program, known as IMAP, to address monitoring and assessment of common indicators to assess the good environment status of the Mediterranean region. More importantly, for this particular discussion is the development of marine protected areas and SPAMIs in the Mediterranean. And throughout these activities, they provide also capacity building and share information and educational material. Some of the achievements of the regional center includes 5 action plan and 1 strategy for the conservation of species, including Mediterranean monk seals, marine turtles, cetaceans, marine and coastal birds, 3 action plans for conservation of habitats, addressing marine vegetation, coralligenous and dark habitats, as well as an action plan on species introduction and invasive species. As we know, the Mediterranean is a semi-enclosed sea and is more susceptible to human impact than more open waters. A recent study has shown that the Mediterranean is among the world biomass that shows the strongest negative response to land use and climate change pressure. The marine environment and the MPAs are particularly sensitive to external threats, including pollution, unsustainable fishing, invasive species, coastal and marine habitats degradation, collision with ships, climate change, and the biggest driver of anthropomorphic threats to the region stem from the tourism, fishing, and shipping and fishing industry. Some figures: the Mediterranean represents 0.3% of the world volume, and it includes 18% of the world known species, with 246 threatened marine species who lives in the region, and a significant regression of biodiversity is already observed, with the following impacts: with loss of ecosystem services, including socioeconomic services, loss of natural protection against erosion, loss of exploitation resources, especially for foods, loss of carbon sequestration potential, and this is caused in particular by the regression of the emblematic Posidonia oceanica seagrass beds by 30% over the last 50 years, which led to the disappearance of 78% of the wet habitat since 1970. Now here you have a slide representing some of the efforts of SPARAC in supporting Mediterranean countries in establishing marine protected areas and SPAMIs, which they undertake through baseline studies. They support the establishment and management of MPAs through the elaboration of management plan, business plan, communication strategy, but also undertake pilot management and monitoring actions, capacity building, and twinning program. These efforts has been intensified during the last 20 years with the entry into force of the SPABD protocol in 1999 and led to 56 sites in 19 countries. And this was possible thanks to the generous support of external donors, including the EU, MAVA Foundation, the FFEM, JEF, Italy, and others. As you can see on the slide, there is officially 1,087 MPAs covering over 209,000 square kilometers, which represent 8.3% of the Mediterranean. And since the since 2016, between 2016 and 2020, there was an increase of 2%, reaching the 8.33% compared to the Aichi target of 10% by 2020. So just to give you some insight on this aspect. Now the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework which was adopted by COP15, include consideration for the implementation of the GEF on cooperation and synergies, including at regional and sub-regional and national level. And the work of the Barcelona Convention will contribute into this, and I'll give you some additional input in the way this is framed. So the Post-2020 Strategy Action Program for the conservation of biological diversity and sustainable management of natural resources in the Mediterranean region, known as Post-2020 SABBIO, is a 15-year life cycle strategy action plan that enable a collective regional implementation of the Barcelona Convention BD protocol. It identifies needs, priorities, synergies for the conservation and sustainable use of marine and coastal biodiversity in the Mediterranean, and the action proposal builds on a participative bottom-up process and are harmonized with the main biodiversity framework at regional and global level, mainly the GBF. The in the same year when the SABBIO was adopted, the post-2020 regional strategy for MCPA and OECM was adopted by all contracting parties. This has two main targets, which you can see on the screen, with at least 30% of the Mediterranean seen as protected and conserved, and by 2030 the number of coverage of MCPA with enhanced protection level is increased. The strategy has 5 strategic pillars with a clear strategic outcome with 20 outputs, supported by 126 proposed action at both contracting parties and regional and international level, and has been identified recognizing that countries are at different stage with regards to the establishment and management of their MCPA. The proposed action under each output, therefore, are meant to be indicative and not prescriptive. And an evaluation and monitoring framework is being prepared for the strategy with the technical support of an ad hoc working group expert for marine protected area in the Mediterranean region. The framework, so to support this, the implementation of this SABBIO and strategy, a resource mobilization strategy is the first step for the to support this action. And in the same time, like the post-2020 SABBIO, it aims to be considered as a frame for coherence amongst regional and national action, seeking to extend possible complementarity and avoiding overlapping of biodiversity conservation programs and marine resources sustainable management. The resource mobilization strategy is built as a space of collective and synergetic action of all the relevant regional and national marine conservation actors in the region. And the objective of the resource mobilization strategy is to ensure financial support that has a swift value to allow a sequence of action for a realistic operational implementation of the post-2020 sub-bio, and provide a description of the kind of support such as capacity building, technical, scientific, legal, and institutional assistance needed by the contracting parties for their efforts in the implementation of the post-2020 sub-bio. Now, this is my last slides, which presents some of the priorities for the next couple of years, which will be proposed for endorsements by the contracting party meeting of the Barcelona Convention in Slovenia in December of this year, and includes restoration programs, upgrading and expanding Mediterranean network of MPAs and OECMs, elaboration of monitoring and evaluation system for MPAs and OECMs, as well as upgrading the conservation status of the Mediterranean endangered and threatened species, as well as through the implementation of the relevant regional and national action plans, and the support to countries in the national monitoring program within the integrating monitoring assessment program, the ecosystem approach process. So I hope my presentation was within the time frame allocated, and I'm happy to answer any question you may have or forward any follow-up answers if required. So thank you very much.
Thank you for presenting all the steps that you have been following for the preparation of the strategy in Barcelona. I think there are some questions arriving, but I suggest you we are running the three presentations from the speakers, and at the end we take some questions and answers for everyone. So right now I'm inviting Theresa Mundita Lim from the Asian Center for Biodiversity to take the floor.
Hello, thank you, Phenia. I have a number of slides, but I'm going to try to see how I can breeze through them so I can finish within time. So this is our experience so far in the ASEAN. This is just a slide on the richness of the marine biodiversity and the marine ecosystem of the ASEAN region. So not gonna dwell on that, but suffice it to say that we do have a significant number of coral reef areas and fisheries, and we have 35% of the world's coral reefs. And so because of this biodiversity, next slide, please. Okay. The ASEAN Center for Biodiversity was established by the 10 ASEAN member states. And we work with the 10 ASEAN countries within Southeast Asia. And of course, this is illustrated on the slides. So in the past year, the 10 ASEAN member states have been, we've been in consultation with the 10 ASEAN member states. There's a process that we follow, and then also through the statements that they have delivered in international meetings. In international meetings, we have been able to gather some of the priorities that they have identified. And initially, some of the marine-related targets which resonate most in the region are targets 2 and 11, 3, 5, 8, 12, 14, 19, 20, and 21. So let me just, So let me just go through the efforts that we and the support that we provide to the ASEAN member states. achieve that we intend to do to achieve all of these targets. Some of these activities that we have been doing that we have identified that are actually what we have already been doing in the past years since we were established in 2005. Next slide, please. So for target 3, ACB supports the establishment and strengthening of governance of marine protected areas and MPA networks and marine biodiversity corridors. Our flagship project, our flagship program, the ASEAN Heritage Parks program, actually provides an incentive for the establishment of protected areas and to effectively manage them in the ASEAN member states. So as of now, there are 55 ASEAN Heritage Parks. These are like the cream of the crop of protected areas. These are protected areas that are important to the region. And as of now, we have 55 ASEAN Heritage Parks, but out of the 55, there's only 9 marine ASEAN Heritage Parks. Okay. But to be able to have a more informed decision-making process in establishing the ASEAN Heritage Parks and marine protected areas, we have been conducting. We were able to conduct next slide, please. A study which we jointly facilitated with the Pew Charitable Trusts that demonstrates how the ASEAN's oceans connect rather than divide the ASEAN territories. Results of this connectivity study provided information on how the countries in the ASEAN region are interconnected through larval exchanges, sources, and sinks. And it also provides information on how the ASEAN, the marine area in ASEAN region is also connected to non-ASEAN territories as far as fisheries and other important fishery resources is concerned. The ACB has also been into a number of discourses in the ABNJ, at the BBNJ on areas beyond areas beyond national jurisdiction, and we have been in consultation with the ASEAN member states and to be able to determine if some of these areas beyond national jurisdiction would be that is important to the ASEAN could be included as to be able to reach the 30% target for protection as articulated in the KMGBF. Okay. So for target 5, in relation to target 5, the ACB has been supporting actions towards effective law enforcement on marine wildlife trade. We also facilitate capacity development initiatives on ecosystem-based management and governance approaches. We support collaboration on science-based decision-making systems that will benefit capture fisheries management and coastal resources management. We also facilitate exchange of knowledge and experiences on coastal marine conservation and sustainable management in the areas, in the marine areas in the ASEAN region. For target 8, to help achieve target 8 on nature-based solutions, the ACB has been working with the ASEAN member states to promote the role of nature and ecosystems, particularly NBS, in linking climate change and biodiversity. We have been participating in both the meetings of and supporting the ASEAN member states, both at the CBD and also at the UN FCCC, which in the last meeting where we were able to share our experiences on the value of nature-based solutions and the importance of biodiversity in climate change, not only in climate change adaptation, but in climate mitigation as well. For target 2 and 11, we think which are related, the ASEAN, we have been another one of our programs is the ASEAN Green Initiative, which is a recognition scheme for effective ecosystem restoration efforts in the region. It encourages the planting of 10 million native tree species in a span of 10 years across the 10 ASEAN member states. And it also emphasizes that the restoration activity would be able to contribute to protecting the coastal communities from the impacts of climate change and extreme weather conditions. For Target 12, parallel to green and blue infrastructure that promote urban biodiversity, mainstreaming of biodiversity in the planning and management of urban areas in the region is one of the targets of our ASEAN Working Group on Nature Conservation and Biodiversity. In a capacity development activity in the Philippines, the ACB was able to invite the National Parks Board of Singapore. So we encourage exchange, sharing of learnings and the rollout of the Singapore Index by encouraging the exchange of information and also looking at integrating the Singapore Index in the planning processes of across the cities in the ASEAN. Okay, for Target 14 on mainstreaming biodiversity, the ACB developed the overall strategic framework on mainstreaming of biodiversity across the ASEAN with the support of the German government through the institutional strengthening of biodiversity sector in the ASEAN project. The center has been forging partnerships with key players from various sectors. Next slide. Including tourism, agriculture, education, infrastructure, health, maritime industries, and fisheries and aquaculture, to name a few. We have produced publications to be able to support the mainstreaming mainstreaming initiatives in the region. We are also prioritizing the development of a regional action plan to mainstream biodiversity in the fisheries sector towards the end of the year. For Target 19, some of the programs and projects of the ACB has supported by its dialogue and development partners have been providing opportunities for increased financial support to the ASEAN member states. So the ACB, so aside from the development partners, of course, the development and dialogue partners of the ASEAN, the ACB as the current chair of the Global Partnership for Business and Biodiversity, has been expanding our partnership with the private sector to ensure that biodiversity considerations are not only integrated into the plans and processes of the business sector, but also opens up opportunities for additional support for regional conservation efforts. The center also maintains the ASEAN Biodiversity Fund, which consists of contributions from all the ASEAN member states and from other governments and organizations. For Target 20, as the region's contribution to the achievement of Target 20, the ACB has been providing capacity development opportunities while providing state-of-the-art technology to the AMS. Some of these initiatives include the spatial monitoring and reporting tool, training for marine ASEAN heritage parks in Thailand, workshops on species identification and using DNA barcoding. So, of course, this is although this we pilot this in some of the ASEAN member states and then eventually scaled up in other at the regional level. ACB and Norway likewise collaborated on mobilizing stakeholders to inform the development of a science-based decision support system for coastal wetlands in the ASEAN region. This initiative aimed to engage stakeholders in the decision support system for coastal and marine conservation and capacitate them to manage their own marine biodiversity data from a regional lens. Okay. And then lastly, Target 21 are our SEPA initiatives. The region has been very active in communicating the need to protect, conserve, and sustainably use our marine resources, and the importance of achieving the marine-related KMGBF targets. The awareness-raising activities include knowledge products related to marine conservation. We have been partnering with mainstream media, celebrities, and other prominent personalities in the region to get the message across a wide range of audience through a campaign called hashtag We Are ASEAN Biodiversity. Okay. So we also share information from our ASEAN Clearinghouse and the ASEAN Biodiversity Dashboard. Next slide. The challenges in achieving the priority targets, of course, is always the insufficient resources. Although the ASEAN member states have been contributing to the ASEAN Biodiversity Fund, and we have been able to engage some partners to be able to achieve some of the targets, really would need to need additional resources to do so. And another challenge is the silo thinking. It's still a challenge to be able to engage the different sectors, although this is already a priority of the ASEAN through their whole of government approach. Cross-sectoral collaboration and cross-pillar collaboration is being encouraged by the leaders. It's still we are still in the stage where we continue to work across the pillars and engage them, and still there's an issue on shared appreciation of biodiversity conservation and its contribution to development. So striking the balance between economic development and conservation of biodiversity is also something that has especially with the as we recover from the pandemic, there's a rush to facilitate economic development, and so we want to make sure that we will be able to ensure that in the economic development processes they will take into account the contribution of biodiversity, and so that's some of the challenges that we have been encountering in meeting in some of our efforts to support the ASEAN member states in meeting the targets, the global biodiversity targets. The enabling conditions we feel which can contribute to the achievement of the KMGBF. Recently, the ASEAN leaders have adopted the blue economy as a priority for cooperation. With this declaration and the regional plan of action on mainstreaming biodiversity in the fisheries sector, the ACB hopes to make a headway in realizing Target 14 in the ASEAN region. Another enabling condition is there's an opportunity to strengthen the relevance of meeting the marine conservation targets, the marine biodiversity targets, by integrating it, or by making sure that it will be part of the post-2025 ASEAN community vision. This presents an opportunity to include marine biodiversity concerns as priorities in the ASEAN. In the recent high-level task force, the ACB high-level task force meeting in Indonesia, the ACB was able to share the value of conserving biodiversity as a nature-based solutions to some of the current global challenges. Next is the ACB will be developing a regional biodiversity strategy and action plan in view of the recently adopted Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Subsequently, the ACB will conduct consultations with the AMS for finalization of this regional action plan, and which should also reflect priorities for the coastal and marine environments in the region. So it is hoped that as we support the ASEAN member states in the updating of their NBSAPs, the regional biodiversity strategy and action plan could be utilized as a guide or a template for the individual NBSAPs of each member state.
May I kindly, sorry, I'm really sorry to interrupt you. May I kindly invite you to conclude your presentations, because we have another speaker, and overall we would like to take some time for the discussion.
All right. Okay. So sorry, Phenia, just one more slide. So the ACB, we have a scientific advisory council as well, which we think the network of scientists in the ASEAN should be able to provide more support to meeting the biodiversity targets and provide the science-based decision-making support. So that's all. Thank you very much for giving me a bit of time for these slides.
Thank you for the great overview of how you adapt the GBF in the Asian area, and also the analysis on the challenges and what could enable a good implementation. And also you have been talking about BBNG, which makes a link with the second session of today's webinar. So yeah, it's a challenging area, we could say so. Thank you also for the discussion in the box with the Q&A. So please continue putting your questions, and some answers have been already provided, and we can keep going. And now our last speaker for this session is Darius Campbell from the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission, NEAFC. The floor is yours, please.
Merci, Phenia. I hope to show my slides now. You can see them now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I'm speaking on behalf of the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission. Very briefly, that's a regional fisheries management organization in the Northeast Atlantic, and our contracting parties are Denmark in respect of Faroes and Greenland, the European Union, Iceland, Norway, the Russian Federation, and the United Kingdom. The focus for our organization is harvesting fish from the high seas for sustainable economic and social benefits, but our convention also includes conservation objectives. And of course, fisheries is one of those human activities that's intimately reliant on the environment and the ecosystem that it impacts in its activities. And as Theresa has mentioned, of course, the tendency to work in silos is there. And I think that's particularly true in most national administrations where fisheries and environment policies sit in different ministries with different drivers for their work. But there are common international drivers for all our work. So UNCLOS, the UN Law of the Sea, the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, the 2020 Sustainable Development Goals, and of course, also the Global Biodiversity Framework. But I think looking back, the awareness of the Aichi targets was not very high in fisheries, or at least not explicitly. And the GBF, I think, has a higher profile, partly for the 30 by 30 target, but also because it's been developed in sort of parallel with the agreement on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction that was agreed in New York a couple of months ago as well. And while I'm talking about the Global Biodiversity Framework and the IDDRI targets, I think it's also worth mentioning at this point the role of the CBD Sustainable Ocean Initiative Global Dialogues. And that's been facilitating engagement between fisheries and conservation international intergovernmental organizations since about 2016. And there have been 3 meetings so far of the Global Dialogue. And that's allowed regional organizations like the Regional Fisheries Management Organizations and the Regional Seas Conventions to meet and discuss and coordinate joint activity related to the ASEAN targets on sustainable use and conservation in different regions. And as an example, in the Northeast Atlantic, there are several organizations all involved in marine policy, whether it's fisheries or conservation. And some of these organizations never spoke to each other maybe 15 years ago. So there's been some development and progress on working on these biodiversity issues together. And looking at the GBF itself, for fisheries, the most relevant goals are on the goal A, on integrity and resilience, and B, on sustainable use. And more specifically, the target 3 on the 30 by 30, that is of interest to fisheries, and target 5 on sustainable use. And of course, also relevant are target 8 on climate change, target 10 on sustainable management, and also target 21 on data and knowledge. So there are various aspects and strands that fisheries will be involved in, but these probably reflect work already in progress at the regional fisheries management organizations like NEAFC. And of course, the GBF refreshes and gives more momentum to these actions. And I'll choose to talk about 2 in more detail. So the first of these is the other effective area-based conservation measures. And as you all will know, that the CBD established the concept of the OECMs as acting towards area-based conservation targets by means other than MPAs, and that they're governed and managed in ways that achieve positive and sustained long-term outcomes for biodiversity. And in the oceans, of course, that includes fisheries measures. And in NEAFC, what we've done since 2021 is to have a process to look through all our area-based measures and to see which ones fit the CBD OECM criteria. And these measures include protection of spawning grounds or juvenile fish, as well as bottom fishing measures that are aimed at the protection of vulnerable marine ecosystems, VMEs, which are sponges and corals. So we did a process to look through all these different measures, not necessarily accepting all of them, but just examining them. And what we've ended up at this stage, at least, is a focus on designating, or we're near to designating, our areas that are closed to bottom fishing to protect vulnerable marine ecosystems. That's the red areas on this map. And these closures are based on independent advice from our scientific advisor, the International Council for Exploration of the Seas. And that's advice on the presence or likely presence of vulnerable marine ecosystems in those areas. And these closures, these red areas, have been in place for 15 years or more, and our regulations are legally binding, and they're fully enforced through monitoring, compliance and surveillance, and also through publicly available compliance reports. And again, as a reminder, in most cases, OECMs will be based on measures that are already in place, which do have clear biodiversity benefits. And NEAFC is also looking at other potential OECMs within the yellow areas on this map, because these areas are restricted to bottom fishing, but don't necessarily have the clear evidence on the biodiversity within those areas. So if we wanted to identify further OECMs within the yellow areas, we'd need to work out what particular biodiversity benefits could be there in order to justify them as OECMs. But I think one thing to remember is that the CBD's discussions are often more about terrestrial perspectives than marine ones. And this means that while it might make sense to have area targets expressed in 2 dimensions when they're looking at the 30 by 30, and that ensures that OECMs and MPAs cannot be double counted in the statistics when they cover the same area. In practice, in our region, in the marine environment, protection and significant biodiversity and ecosystems often overlap, but in 3 dimensions. So it's not just a question of thinking about looking at it from on top, but also you're looking at it from the side. And for instance, a good example of that is that NEAFC has measures that offer protection to the seabed, while the OSPAR Convention, which deals with non-fisheries measures, is offering protection to the water column through its MPAs in the same areas. And while we will avoid double counting in terms of the simple area-based GBF targets, we do also need to have a narrative to describe how these 3-dimensional interactions provide benefits to biodiversity in practice. And this also, I think, gives us one of the key wins for the OECMs, given that we're already doing measures, is that it can be a good basis for further coordination between organizations such as ours and OSPAR on measures and on benefits. And within the Northeast Atlantic, we already have a mechanism called the collective arrangement, which means that we can discuss our OECMs and MPAs together, and we try and collaborate on common issues such as bycatch or monitoring and assessment. Now, the science questions that underlie these sort of considerations, say between the seabed ecosystems and the ecosystems of the pelagic waters, are an important part of our consideration. For NEAFC, our decisions relate to trading off sustainable use with its economic and social benefits against environmental benefits. So how much economic activity can I do on the seabed, and in what way, without significantly impacting the ecosystems of the waters above? And we don't need to do this just in theoretical descriptions of the links between the ecosystems, but we need sufficient quality of science and specifics to make management decisions. And that's, as we have ICES as our independent scientific advisor, it's a privilege. And again, that relates to the GBF Target 21 on having that data and knowledge in place. The other GBF targets highlight the issue about sustainable use and respecting the impacts on the ecosystem. And fisheries, our fisheries have a clear focus on providing sustainable protein for human consumption. And the big benefit that NEAFC fisheries does provide is millions of tons of relatively low carbon, low impact food protein that ends up all over the world, including countries like Egypt and Nigeria. But this must be produced sustainably. And that's why the ecosystem-based approach to fisheries management has been an important element that's been in place for many years, for instance, in the FAO Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries, in the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, and also in FAO guidance. And so implementing an ecosystem-based fisheries management approach is a challenge that we need to deal with. And ICES is already helping in trying to assess how well we're doing that in NEAFC. And also it's developing its own ecosystem-based advice and the processes that underlie this so that it can better advise us. And we also have instruction within a NEAFC senior level strategic group to make more progress on ecosystem-based management in light of developing international understanding, including other RFMOs. And so developing an ecosystem-based approach has lots of challenges. How do we describe our objectives with regard to the ecosystem structure and function more clearly to help ICES in advising us? How do we improve the data that fisheries can produce, particularly on bycatch? Linking back to the OECM issue, we have good data on our vulnerable marine ecosystems. We have good understanding of monitoring and the presence or lack of fishing activity in those areas, but we don't carry out the expensive business of ongoing monitoring of biodiversity. So what kind of supplemental biodiversity monitoring do we need for these areas? And is that available through partners such as OSPAR? And this is my last slide. So in conclusion, I think I just briefly outline some of the progress that we're making on actions that are in line with the Global Biodiversity Framework, even if they're not necessarily primarily driven by it. But I think it's just showing that these actions are working in tandem. And I think that that also underlines the best effort that we need to do is to ensure that there's more and more cooperation and collaboration going on between those whose primary interest is conservation and those who are coming from more of a sustainable use perspective, as well as those with the science and knowledge to inform those actions. So engagement is the most essential thing we need to do to deliver the Global Biodiversity Framework targets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have also a global view on how you have been, let's say, aligned to the CBD framework and the Global Biodiversity Framework from COP15, but it's a long time working already on in this framework. We have some, well, we can take some question and answers. So some of the questions have been already answered in the box. I have, well, Darius Campbell, you were talking about CBD's Sustainable Ocean Initiative and the Global Dialogue, which gathers together secretariats from regional organizations about the regional seas conventions or fisheries, or maybe there are some global sectorial organizations also associated. And well, this is not only for you, it's for the three of you. You tell me who would like to answer. There is a question on NBSAPs, which are the National Biodiversity and Strategic Action Plans. So how do you work with your parties to enable the implementation of the national strategies, national biodiversity strategies? Who would like to answer to these questions from the three speakers? Yeah, okay, thank you.
I'll start the ball rolling. Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I do underline the challenge there is of making sure that the colleagues I work with on fisheries are also working closely with their biodiversity colleagues. Obviously, the secretariats can make contacts, and we work very closely with the secretariats, but it's no good just the secretariats doing that. So it's really just a practical thing, constant feedback one way or another, trying to get parties to work together. But I am seeing that is happening more and more, and therefore, you know, the big push, for instance, on OECMs is coming from some of our parties working within NEAFC, but they are also now starting to coordinate with their colleagues in OSPAR and also at the national level in terms of, for instance, the Norwegian or the Icelandic national plans on OECMs and MPAs. So I think it's something you just got to keep pushing on and pushing on and pushing on. It needs work, and it needs people who are willing to champion that kind of cross-sectoral work. That's my view.
Thank you very much. Maybe another question for the Barcelona Convention, as well, you have a conference of the parties at the end of the year. You had already led a donors conference to starting supporting the strategic action plan for biodiversity. Nevertheless, what will be the key topics in the agenda for the COP, and what are the needs, the challenges for the parties to implement the Global Biodiversity Framework in the Mediterranean Sea?
Well, the answer to your first question is a bit premature, because we're still a few months from the COP itself, and there is still few discussion to have with colleagues and others to address the agenda of the contracting parties. So obviously there is introduction of the work which has been done within the current program of work, and including these efforts carried out by SPARAC to mobilize resources to support the implementation of the sub-bio and the regional strategies for the MPAs OECMs, and I would say the main challenges which have been seen in the region, beside the efforts to try to expand and to reach the 30% target by 2030, is also the governance and maintenance of the actual declared MPAs in the region, where there is a need for not only resource mobilization, but also a strong effort from the local community near those areas, and cooperation in some cases where these areas are covering different countries. There is, in addition to the donor conference that we've discussed, there is also an effort to increase cooperation at regional level with main actors from NGOs, but also from the Union for the Mediterranean. We just met them last week in Barcelona, and there is also linkage with supports to continue from the European Union also to continue contributing technically, but also financially in this effort. But yeah, indeed, there is a strong will from the countries as they formally adopted this strategy, which include those targets of 30 by 30. We've seen also in my presentation that compared to the 2020 Aichi targets, we are nearly there with 8.33 compared to 10%. So we still have a long path to go, but efforts and cooperation will hopefully prevail and enable the region to address this global challenge at regional level.
Thank you very much. Maybe a last quick question for Theresa Lim. I was wondering how in Asia and with the countries with whom you are working with, how do you handle with the pollution issues in your strategies and action plans? There will be negotiations for a future treaty also, and on plastic as we had for the high season and BBNJ. But is it something you have included in the strategies?
Yes, actually, there's already an ASEAN cooperation agreement on addressing plastic pollution in the region. So there was and based on this, we can already identify certain actions, because the ASEAN member states already recognize that plastic pollution move around, and it affects all of the countries. So the action should be coordinated, and so because there's already an adopted declaration on that. This is already our basis to incorporate certain actions. Provisions of that can already be incorporated as part of initially for the Regional Biodiversity Strategy Action Plan, which we are preparing in consultation with the AMS, and hopefully it will redound. It will be translated as part of the National Biodiversity Strategy Action Plan for each country.
So thank you very much for these highlights. And thank you, the three of you, for your contribution to today's discussion. I invite you to continue. I saw that you have already answered to the participants' questions. And right now, we will move forward with the second session. So I give the floor to Glen Wright as this way he can present you the program for the next hour.
Thanks very much, Phenia.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Phenia. And thanks very much to those three presenters for some really interesting regional perspectives. We'll zoom out a little further now and look towards the high seas. And I see that our first speaker, Fanny, her slides are entitled An Idea Whose Time Has Come. And if any of you have been following the high seas negotiations as we have for the past 15 years, then you'll know that this is certainly an idea whose time has come. And so we'll look into a bit today how this treaty can hopefully strengthen and support some of the ongoing efforts, and in particular by creating marine protected areas. So the treaty makes a process for this, and by strengthening impact assessment as well. So we'll hear from Fanny first on UNESCO's World Heritage Programme, which some years ago already started proposing the potential for high seas areas of sort of outstanding universal value. Jorge Jiménez, that has been working in the MarViva Foundation on the Costa Rica Thermal Dome. And then finally, Tim White for a bit of a more technological perspective from Global Fishing Watch on how we can actually control, monitor, and implement some of these areas. So with that, Fanny, I'll leave the floor to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Glen. Thank you, everyone, for joining. So my name is Fanny Douvere, and I'm the head of the Marine Program at UNESCO's World Heritage Center. And you can go to the next slide. So for those of you who are not familiar with the World Heritage Convention, it was built in 1972, and it's basically very well known for the World Heritage List, which has today over 1,000 sites, both cultural places and natural places. But among those, over 1,000 sites are also 50 ocean places. So it started, the first marine site that was inscribed on the World Heritage List was in 1982 with Australia's Great Barrier Reef, but it has grown over those 40 plus years into a global network. In fact, 40 years into a global network of about 50 sites today in 37 different countries. So you see these on the map. And as you see very well on the map as well, all of those current World Heritage sites are in areas within national jurisdictions. So in 2011, there was a external audit that was done on the World Heritage list. And the external auditors found one of their key conclusions of the World Heritage Committee was that there are actually no areas beyond national jurisdiction. And since that covers over half of our planet, the fact that it was a World Heritage Convention wasn't actually truly world, but also only applied to half of the planet. So that recommendation was taken up by the World Heritage Committee, was adopted, and the Secretariat, which is hosted by UNESCO, the World Heritage Secretariat, was asked to prepare the groundwork to look into this topic of high seas or World Heritage sites in the high seas. So we did that work together with our official advisory body for all natural world heritage, which is IUCN. And between 2015 and 2021, UNESCO, alongside with IUCN, worked basically together with some of the top scientists around the world, both in high seas conservation, but also in the area of just simply biodiversity, and especially those special areas all over the world that are in the high seas, but might also be supporting areas that are within national jurisdiction just by their sheer way of their ecosystem functioning. So that work actually covered a number of aspects. It covered, on the one hand, the political and legislative aspects of the World Heritage Convention. So it's a convention is a international legal instrument that on the one hand includes the World Heritage List, so new sites get added every year, but at the same time, once a site is inscribed on the World Heritage List, it also becomes the responsibility of a country to protect those places. So on the one hand, the work that was done between 2015 and 2021 looked into how the World Heritage Convention potentially could be amended to cover areas beyond national jurisdiction. The interesting factor there is that the convention was signed in 1972, and it is only in 1982 that UNCLOS came into being and made that distinction between areas within national jurisdiction and areas beyond national jurisdiction. So in a way, you could consider that the World Heritage Convention was signed ahead of its time to protect ocean places, and it might just simply be a historic oversight that the World Heritage Convention today is not protecting areas in the high seas. So those are considerations that were all researched quite extensively, and most of that work was led by very well-known high seas legal experts, and all of that work is available online on the UNESCO website. What I want to share just very briefly a few words about is the other component, is really the scientific work that went into looking at what places might actually potentially be World Heritage sites. And what that basically means is that these would be places that could meet the World Heritage criteria. If I could have the next slide, please. So the World Heritage Convention has 10 criteria. So it has 6 criteria that are relating to anything that is cultural World Heritage. And it has four criteria that are related to ecosystems and biodiversity. And basically the World Heritage Convention protects truly those outstanding and exceptional places, either places that are outstanding stages or represent outstanding stages in Earth history. And that's in many cases geological features, but it also looks at iconic places from an ecosystem perspective, places that you don't find anywhere else, or biodiversity and so natural habitats that for the most part have truly unique and endemic species that are not found anywhere else, or that have a composition of biodiversity that is supporting a huge amount of other types of species in other places around the world. Now, those 3 criteria are mostly used either by themselves or together, but there is then, of course, also the 4th one, which is exceptional beauty. But since that is very subjective, the World Heritage Convention doesn't use that by itself. It's typically used in combination of the others. So World Heritage sites that are inscribed today, they can be for one of those criteria inscribed on the World Heritage list. But for example, the Galapagos Islands is inscribed for all 4 of those World Heritage criteria, and so is, for example, Australia's Great Barrier Reef. So the scientific work that was done alongside with IUCN, but very much led by an international team of biologists and ecologists and high seas experts, was to look at which areas within the high seas could actually adhere to those criteria, could match those criteria. And so there's a very lengthy process that went into that. It's was done over multiple years. And again, you can find all the details and the scientific analysis online, but I will just run you through 5 kind of top locations that really came out of that analysis, and which you in a way can you can describe them a little bit as you know, the Taj Mahals, so to speak, of the open ocean. I think there's a lot of people, and you can go to the next slide, please. There's a lot of people that think of the high seas as, you know, a place that is dark and deep, and there might be something happening, but what's happening there is actually not necessarily all that interesting. I think the majority of the people think that way, except of course for many among us here on this webinar, because we're familiar with that work and we know ocean conservation and what's out there very well. But the majority of the people do not think that way. So the World Heritage Convention, even if it would not by itself protect some of these places, it could actually have a tremendous value in promoting some of the areas that might, as I said earlier, be the quote Taj Mahals of the open ocean, and speak to the imagination of people that are ultimately people that could vote for leaders that might want to protect the high seas and MPAs in the high seas, which is today the majority of nations on our planet, as we've seen with the treaty that just was agreed. So when we looked at that, when we looked at the World Heritage criteria and applied those to special areas in the high seas, we, as you can see there, came up with some quite phenomenal names and IDs and places that do speak actually to the imagination. We found places that are sunken fossil islands, that are giant volcanoes that basically dwarf any mountain that you can find on Earth, floating golden rainforests, 60-meter high spires of rock that look like a lost city. Those are the kind of things that do speak to people's imagination, and that you quite clearly can promote for protection way beyond the typical scientific and legislative community that we tend to communicate within. So the next slide, please. I will just run you through some of the areas that came out of that analysis. So we came up with 5. There are other sites that are, of course, out there that perfectly could match those World Heritage criteria if we looked at it in more depth. An important aspect is that a lot of information is not known yet about the biodiversity and ecosystems in areas beyond national jurisdiction. I had the opportunity myself to go to 300 meters depth in one of these areas, and you can see very well that really the large majority, I would say probably only about 1%, is actually known to science today. So what I'm sharing with you is only what we know today. What is not known is obviously not something that we could analyze to see whether it actually met the World Heritage criteria. So the 5 sites that we came up with, which is the very first indication, you see them there on the map. So they were quite well distributed across the planet. But again, of course, this is just a first snapshot. Next slide, please. So the first of those 5 is called the Lost City Hydrothermal Field. It is a very remarkable geobiological feature. It's located somewhere in the middle of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. It is basically constituted of the 60-meter high carbonate edifice, but it is one of those places that, as I said earlier, a lost city truly speaks to the imagination. This is just one of the photos. The interesting thing is also very few audio-visual material to show these places, but this is one of the photos you can see here. But it basically is just an incredible special place that you just can relate to when you just look at those images. There's some indications that it might be also a place where life on Earth debuted, but there's of course other places as well that claim that, but it might have some of those features. And it sits at about 800 meters depth, which is not huge for the high seas. But an interesting feature is that those sprinkler-like outgrowths, those, they look like chimneys basically, that they're, the way they function they have been doing so for over 120,000 years. So destroying some of these places for some of the things they might have for future products that we might want to develop as humans, it is important to actually look at that also for its pure heritage to the common to us as humankind and for future generations. The next slide, please. So the next slide is the next site is a very different location. It's called again a name that is very speaks very much to the imagination. It's called the White Shark Cafe. So it is actually a fairly pristine ocean area that sits halfway between North America and Hawaii. And it's one of those places where it's actually the only known place where North Pacific white sharks congregate, and they congregate there probably to mate but also to feed, and so we call it a cafe because it's one of the only known places where those large and unique predators are actually congregating in a very determined way, in a very specific way. And some of that phenomenon has also been filmed by colleagues, including National Geographic. So those are highly migratory marine species that have huge functions also in other areas around that area, but globally as well. And again, is one of those places, if you protect this place in the open ocean, that it might also have huge benefit for a lot of other species and ecosystems that we might not know all those connectivity aspects of today. Next slide, please. So the next slide, please. So the next place is, of course, very well known to everybody. It was already actually described and discovered probably by Columbus when he made his first voyage to the US in 1495. It is the Sargasso Sea, and it's, I think many of you are very familiar with it. It is basically a huge floating sargassum seaweed of incredible proportions, which has a very temporal and seasonal dynamic ecosystem, and again provides a lot of benefits and habitat and resources for other species that we both know and don't know. So it's located off the coast of Bermuda. And as I said earlier, it has one of these phenomenal names, again, that do speak to the imagination. We call it the golden rainforest of the ocean. So that is another one of the sites. The next one is the Atlantis Bank. If I can have the next slide, please. Atlantis, I think the slides are gone. So the next place, if I could have the slides back up, the next slide is basically the Atlantis Bank. Also, again, it's located in the Southwest Indian Ridge, but again, one of these truly stunning and highly diverse areas that with a lot of species that are actually not even known to science today. It's uniquely diverse, and it's actually the first tectonic sunken fossil island that was ever studied in history. The last one is, I will just briefly mention, it's the Costa Rica Dome, but I believe that Jorge will share with you a bit more about that. I'm not sure, I think the slides were a little bit mixed there, but so those are the 5 ones. So the Costa Rica Dome, Atlantis Bank, Sargasso Sea, White Shark Cafe, and the Lost City. Again, you can look at more in it within the information that is online. So basically, you can go to the second to last slide. So how can these places be protected? I think I alluded a little bit to that at the beginning. It could be done through the World Heritage Convention, although it's another story for another presentation. That is hugely challenging to do it there, but I think there's also really a huge opportunity here to communicate to a wider public the reasons, what is out there and why it should be protected in ways that people can relate to it. And I feel the World Heritage Convention could very well be a mechanism to do that. And the last slide, please. So all of it is online. There's, again, been research done between 2015 and 2021, both on the legal aspects, policy aspects, and the biodiversity elements, which I reflected some. It's all written in the reports and available online. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to address those. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Fanny. And I would highly recommend those reports, certainly some of the very early work on looking at which MPAs could be identified, and hopefully now there's a new treaty, this can be further pushed to do some work under the Heritage Convention and use the science that you've developed. So without further ado, we'll pass on to Jorge, who will go into a bit more depth into one of these areas. Jorge, please.
Yeah, thank you, Glen. I'm gonna share my screen, I guess. This is it. Can you see me now?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'm gonna be talking a little bit about the Costa Rica Thermal Dome, and instead of going into the biological, ecological aspects of it, I'm gonna be focusing on what we have learned in terms of governance of these areas in the last few years that we have been trying to develop this region. One of the big challenges that we are facing is the fact that usually what we are dealing with is in the BBNJ is is dynamic features that moves around and extends in the BBNJ, but also moves into the EEC of the countries. So this level of complexity of having a dynamic feature is one of the things that we're going to be facing in the upcoming years when we are trying to implement the convention as it goes. If you look at, for example, in the thermal dome, you can see how it changed. This is biomass of zooplankton in different seasons of the year, and when there is ENSO or an ENSO positive or an ENSO negative phenomenon in the region. And you can see how, if you look at the column, the central column, when it's neutral, how is the normal years, if we can call them normal, the normal years in the region, and how it changed when you have a La Nina or negative ENSO phenomenon, and so how biomass and therefore all the associated aspects of the ecosystem change with the season. The other reality is that we are dealing with multiple jurisdictions in a region like this, because it's not only high seas, but it also deals with the EEC of at least 5 or 6 other countries. So therefore, this is something that needs to be taken into account, because of course, what we are facing is uneven policies and regulations and the different EECs, very incipient policies at the high seas, and the need to level them and to coordinate and reach some type of similarity or common purpose on them is going to be one of the challenges that we're going to be facing in the upcoming decades. And this is something that reminds me of a former presentation in which the message was engage. And this is something that we are going to have to be doing in the upcoming years here, not only at the national, but also regional and international fora. This is also other big aspect of the that we have learned is that these sites are not really isolated, but highly linked with different regions of the world. So you have, for example, the blue whale coming 2,000-3,000 miles from Oregon and California to reproduce in this area. You have silky sharks moving along the eastern tropical Pacific and using this area as one of the feeding spots. The same with the leatherback turtle, and even there is a high endemism in some of the species that shows a strong association in their distribution with the dome. So you cannot really think on site-based measures for this type of regions, because as we have learned, for example, with the leatherback turtle, you can invest millions of dollars in managing a population in the EEC of Costa Rica, but actually the effect on this population is happening thousands of miles away, and the EEC of the Chilean country where the adults are being caught by the fishery fleet. So it is demanding a lot of coordination on managing not only multi-jurisdictional sites, but migratory species that are not certainly subject to site-based measures only. So this is something that we need to address in the upcoming decades also. And I just want to raise attention to that. The other big aspect that we have is the larger scales of these features. You know, in the maximum range of the thermal dome, you have over 2,000 kilometers of an area, even though the average is usually 300, 500 kilometers. You can reach 2,000 kilometers in the maximum range, and 650 kilometers in the in the width of the and the width of the dome. So this is larger scales features in the area that not only encompass EEC, but a significant portion of the high seas, and therefore you are immediately confronted with the big challenges. One of them is ecosystem analysis. You need to understand this feature that includes thousands of kilometers of area. The management measures for this area are a challenge in themselves, not only because we have now to address the scale of it, but to confront the limitations of the different countries and agencies to manage this vast area. And then, even if we start implementing some measures in that area, control and surveillance of these large scale elements are a challenge in itself. And I hope to hear something from Global Fishing Watch in this area, because this is one of the aspects that worries us the most. One of the other aspects that we have confronted is the combination of multiple sectors in this area. So that basically what we have is a interest, you know, like in this case of navigation, where we have about 6% of the world navigation moving throughout the dome because of the Panama Canal. But we have one of the world's largest tuna fisheries ground on top of it, and at the same time we have in this same area EPSAs, IMAs, ISRAs being declared because of the importance of the region, and immediately you are confronted with a multiple sectorial interests in a single site, and how to deal with them. Will demand a lot of coordination with different agencies, and this is something that also we will need to be taken into account, because this coordination is not only at the sectorial level, but it's the multiple sectorial level and multiple scale level. So, for example, for the Costa Rica thermal dome, we have already significant interest by regional bodies like the SICA, like OSPESCA, like CCAD, like COCATRAM, which are at themselves sectorial interest bodies that are trying to integrate measures in the ECs of the Central American countries, but because of the high seas component of the dome, we will need to interact with the RFMOs in the region, with IMO, with the CBD, with UNESCO, with CMS. Therefore, the coordination aspect of this is humongous. Is something that will need a lot of effort and resources also to be able to coordinate the different aspects of this. Of the sites, which will at the same time call into a governance scheme of very complex nature, because it's a governance scheme that will involve jurisdictional rights, will involve analytical and implementation measures with different capabilities at the different sectors, at the different countries, at the different bodies, with policy differences. You know, between, let's say, Guatemala or the high seas and Costa Rica, and the different countries will have their own policies, and we have to reach some similarity in and common purpose on this in these policies. We have to be able to coordinate the sectorial interests, which sometimes are our country and in this region, and of course this has to be done at the multiple level institutions. So what I'm trying to say here is that that one of the things that we have been learning during the last few years working on this region is not only the complexity of getting scientific ecological information in that area, but the significant challenge that we are going to be facing in the upcoming years, trying to manage and implement management measures in this area to develop control and surveillance actions in these areas because of the not only the large scale, the dynamic nature of the features, but the multiple jurisdictional levels that we are confronting and the differences in the institutional frameworks at the high seas and the different countries that have interest in the site. I think that will be all from my part. Glen, thanks a lot for the attention.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Jorge. And sounds like you've got plenty of work on your agenda for the coming years. So I'll pass very quickly, given the time, on to Tim, who also has a huge work to do, I think, with the High Seas Treaty upcoming and all the work Global Fishing Watch is doing. So Tim, I'll give you the floor to tell us how you will conduct MCS on the Costa Rica Dome. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here today. Just pulling up the presentation now. Awesome. So you're all able to see that. I see from a thumbs up. Perfect. Yeah. So today I'll be speaking about how, building off of these last two talks that have helped identify what places in our ocean might be prioritized for protection, this talk is going to focus on how the latest satellite technology and machine learning approaches can help kind of implement that in terms of enforcement, in terms of understanding some of the marine spatial planning behind those processes. My name is Tim. I'm a senior manager of analysis at Global Fishing Watch, which is a nonprofit that uses machine learning and satellite technology to track human activity at sea. To start off, you've heard in actually both of these last two talks about some really special areas of our oceans. These areas have been identified in part through technologies like you see here. This is myself in the black and Dr. Barbara Block next to me putting a satellite tag on a great white shark so that through its life and with the animal tracker on board it, it can identify what areas of the ocean are most important for that species. And that's led to insights such as the Great White Shark Cafe that the UNESCO talk pointed out and other hotspots. At Global Fishing Watch, if you remember one thing about this talk, it's that recent advances in the tracking of fishing vessels instead of the tracking of fish have led to similar insights for our oceans. So identifying hotspots of fishing activity, identifying, helping to further insights of who's doing what, where, and when have really been advanced in the last few years, which helps us do things like design more sensible marine spatial planning for our oceans. Before getting into some of those satellite insights, I want to clarify that we very much see new satellite technology as being important complements to some of the existing data streams that already exist, like vital components of the same toolbox, as opposed to replacements or anything like that. So this is me here on the left, back when I had a really big beard and was very cold on board a crab fishing vessel in Alaska, working as a fisheries observer. And this is one of the main data streams that helps managers around the world figure out who's doing what at sea in terms of fishing, in terms of catch, in terms of bycatch. And so it's a really critical data set, but like every fisheries data set, it has its challenges. One challenge is that depending on the fishery, depending on the location, just taking longliners as an example, maybe around 1 out of every 20 longline vessels has a fisheries observer on board at any given time, which means you get really great data, but also there's some concerns over like bias on behavior, where, for instance, fisheries observers are not cops, but fishermen kind of see them as cops sometimes. And so if you had a police officer in your car for 1 out of every 20 times you took a drive, it might influence your behavior in terms of, how much you sped or how much you followed the law. So all that's to say that newer satellite technologies can help complement some of these other data sets. And offer a little different lens on what may be happening at sea. So at Global Fishing Watch, we use a technology called the Automatic Identification System, or AIS, that some 300,000 vessels around the world are transmitting to record the vessel's location and then process that into a vessel track and freely release this at globalfishingwatch.org, for free to anybody with an internet connection, so that folks around the world can make use of this data for whatever decision-making they may be undertaking. It quickly becomes quite a big data challenge because, like I said, there's 300,000 vessels actively broadcasting AIS on any given day on average. This could be around 50 million messages coming through. So to make sense of all this information, we have developed machine learning algorithms to help identify from the vessel track alone what fishing gear that vessel is using, because as you can see, a trawler looks quite different than a longliner or a purse seiner based on the vessel track alone. And then we also identify when that vessel is fishing in its path. So when is it just transiting from A to B, and when is it actively setting fishing gear according to our algorithms? And this is what that picture looks like when you shrink down from all detections of all vessels around the world to just estimated or apparent fishing activity by fishing vessels. So this was a paper led by David Kruidsma going on 5 years ago now that released those algorithms, released the source code behind them, released all the data sets related to that publicly. And along with that paper, we identified that those algorithms are around 98 to 99% accurate. So not perfect, no algorithm ever is, but for things like marine spatial planning of the high seas or of domestic waters, they can offer quite a powerful insight to the bigger picture trends that are happening. I should also point out some of the downsides to AIS as well, because, as I said, any scientist would know that any data set has its pros and cons. So the pros of AIS are that you get a low cost or free view of tens of thousands of vessels around the world from many different flags, many different fisheries. So it can offer you some really nice insights for free. Some of the cons are that not all vessels use AIS, especially coastally, like smaller coastal vessels typically don't. So depending on your area of interest, if you're looking further offshore, it's usually quite a good match to those questions. If you're looking coastally, it may not have good coverage of the fishery you're interested in. So that's one downside. Another downside is that vessels can turn off their AIS, but you can then use that behavior to offer some quite rich insights into what may be happening at sea. For example, this is a figure from a recent study led by Heather Welch, who is a researcher at NOAA in the US. And she led a paper where she looked at the behavior of vessels around the world turning off their vessel trackers, so disabling their AIS devices. Previously, it was pretty hard to figure out when that disabling may have been actually happening versus when maybe satellite reception was poor or other issues such as that. But so by building an algorithm to identify when vessels may be turning off their trackers, this can offer some real rich insights. If, for instance, you see hotspots of vessels turning off their trackers right outside of a marine protected area or right outside of an exclusive economic zone that may not have a great deal of enforcement capacity. So this is one really quick example for how these kinds of newer satellite insights can help make possible some of the ambitions that we've heard today about protections in domestic or international waters. It's kind of helping to arm enforcement agencies with some richer intel to make their patrols more effective, which is exactly what a growing number of agencies around the world are currently doing. So through a partnership with the US Coast Guard, we've been providing these kinds of data sets directly to their enforcement and patrol planning teams so that when you're faced with the vast challenge of, okay, we have X number of patrol vessels in the North Pacific Ocean, where do we put them and when? Making those decisions partially informed by the latest insights for where fishing vessels are, who's fishing where, who's disabling their trackers, that can make those patrols a lot more effective. And we've seen that across the world. I also wanted to mention some other potential uses for how these technologies can help make some of the ambitions that you heard of today a reality. And so I wanted to point out that so far this talk, I've talked about mainly the human activity side of things, but increasingly folks are interested in viewing human activity alongside some other data sets, such as oceanographic information or biological data. Maybe they have animal telemetry data that they want to view alongside human activity data. And so to help inform that marine spatial planning process, we have built this tool founded by Donna Bertarelli and other funders that combines human activity data, oceanographic data, and biological data so that marine managers can inform a variety of the decisions that they may have to make, and so that the general public as well can see this information stacked alongside each other. For example, the Marine Manager portal has a variety of analytical features built into it, and one of those features is the ability to look at protected areas or look at exclusive economic zones, or really any shape on the water, and look at what's changed over time. Say, if you put in a marine protected area at a given time, what did fishing look like before then? What did fishing look like after then? As one example, this is a protected area that many of you will likely know because of its actual imminent removal, but this was the Phoenix Islands protected area in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And with just a few clicks, you can set up, hey, I care about this square on the water. This is the date that I'm interested in looking at. And then you can look at how fishing changed once the MPA was actually implemented, so that, in near real time, in addition to putting some of these big shapes on the map and saying no fishing is allowed, you can get some quite near real-time feedback on what's actually changing on the water, which I think it will really help things like 30 by 30 proceed in a thoughtful manner. You can also pull the information out of any of these tools. All the tools that I've talked about today, you can directly download that and bring that elsewhere if you're more comfortable working in a different software. So in the interest of time, I will skip a few slides, but I did want to mention that the tool, like I just mentioned, that looks at how things change when you create an MPA, this has also fueled some related studies on what actually happens when folks around the world create large marine protected areas in terms of its change on fishing. So I led a study a few years ago that looked at 5 of the most recent large marine protected areas around the world and looked at, okay, before the MPA was created, which is the left column, after the MPA was created, that's the middle column, what changed, which is the rightmost column. And we saw that around 4 out of 5 big MPAs around the world tended to be unfished both before and after protection. So, MPAs are being placed in areas where there wasn't much fishing to begin with, which there's a rich debate about whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. And we don't intend to solve that, but we do intend to help put this information out there so that folks can say, this is what happened in terms of fishing when we created the MPA. Does this match our policy objective? And is this the course that we intend to be on? So I think having open data to assess those kinds of policies will help lead to the best oceans for all of us. Actually, I did want to mention this just briefly, that I mentioned this Marine Manager portal can combine information on both human use and what fish are doing, or what biological data is available depending on data availability. So I wanted to briefly mention one example that we did in the Northeast Pacific Ocean at the White Stripe Cafe, in fact, which has been mentioned earlier, to understand who may be fishing these waters and which nations may have a role in ensuring the continued health of these waters. So for this particular study, we figured out through many years of tagging led by Barbara Block and many others where the hotspots of use were for tunas and sharks, which are these 2 figures here. And then we overlap that with this free information on which fishing vessels and which flags are operating in these same waters. And by overlapping them, we saw that, the challenge of protecting or managing the high seas is, of course, immense. It can seem more immense when you look at the list of dozens and dozens of nations that are fishing the high seas at any given point. But when we zoom that down to the Northeast Pacific Ocean, including the White Stripe Cafe, we end up seeing that a relatively small number of nations end up driving the vast majority of overlap with certain species on the high seas, of course. So in this case, the different bars show the different species that we looked at for this study, and the fill of the bar, or the colors, shows which countries overlap with those species the most. And so I think through analyses such as this, it can shrink down that list from, there's dozens and dozens of nations, the high seas are vast, but often that overlap is quite restricted to a few countries and a relatively small area. So when you think about things like UNESCO sites, these kinds of analyses can help inform that process. So I think in the interest of time, I'll just wrap up with one final example to say that, I mentioned AIS does not cover all vessels. There's no one technology that does, but I think we're at a really exciting time for monitoring our oceans right now, in that there's a number of simultaneous complementary technologies that are all developing quite quickly. And by combining these technologies, you can get quite a good view of what's happening at any given point in the ocean. And as one quick example of that, our team, led by Jae-yoon Park, a data scientist, recently combined optical imagery, radar detections, infrared detections, AIS, to look at illegal fishing in North Korean waters. And by combining these, found that some, hundreds and hundreds of vessels confidently detected were illegally fishing in these waters, which amounted to an assumed or an estimated illegal catch of almost $500 million per year. So while the challenges facing our ocean are immensely vast, the technology available to help put a number and put a scale on those challenges is getting better and better every day. So I think that things are tipping in favor of effective management around the world. With that, I just want to say thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Tim. I always enjoy seeing your presentations and Global Fishing Watch data, and I would highly recommend people go and play around with the Marine Manager tool and look at Global Fishing Watch's website. Thanks also for your time management. I'll stick with you because we don't have much time, but perhaps I could pose the same question to all three panelists, and I'll start with you, Tim, as just to what you think the new High Seas Treaty could bring to your work, and conversely, do you see Global Fishing Watch interacting with the treaty institutions once they're operational?
Yeah, I think to answer the second chunk of that first, I see, so Global Fishing Watch is, I think, we have positioned to be like kind of the data that power, or that can help, one of many, many data sets that can help kind of power and inform these decisions, such as where and how do we protect certain spatial areas on the high seas. So I could absolutely see us interacting in that way, not ourselves personally advocating for one particular space versus the other, but saying, if you are going through the process of saying which space might warrant protection, here's some of the available data layers you might want to consider, such as who's fishing where, what's shipping activity looking like, where are some potential IUU risks in cases such as vessels turning off their AIS? Because I think if you have that information going into your protections from the beginning, you're much more likely to help identify the right areas and help identify areas that you practically can enforce in the first place. And what was the first part of your question again?
It was whether the High Seas Treaty will sort of bring something, to your work, but perhaps actually your role will be more giving the data rather than sort of being supported by the treaty in the end.
Yeah, I think that nails it. I think it does bring something to the work because I think it's really thrilling, the insights that we may have to offer for high seas protection. So I think as there's growing interest in that space, we're really excited to help contribute through our data.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. And Jorge, for your region and for your projects, the same thing. Do you think the High Seas Treaty will be supportive, and will you be interacting with the institutions?
Yes, I think that the High Treaty agreement will be the High Seas agreement will bring one big challenge, one big difference, I guess, is in the general scenario, and is that for the first time the biodiversity will have a strong voice in the arena of sectors in the high seas, because that was something that was not present. What I'm trying to say here is that I don't have expectations that other users will not continue to use, but that that it will demand more negotiations and more agreements in the sense that now conservation has a stronger voice in this arena, and that's what I think that is going to make a difference once the treaty is endorsed by the different countries. That it will make a difference in the sense that now conservation will have something to say in this arena and will demand more coordination with sectors like fishing and navigation, especially mining, etc.
Right, thanks very much, Jorge. And Fanny, I'll leave the final word to you. Will a BBNJ COP in 5 years be debating high seas world heritage?
Well, the ideal situation, of course, is that those sites could be protected through the 1970 convention itself, through the World Heritage Convention itself. It is nearly universally ratified, so that would be an ideal route. But I think, I think that this treaty really opens the route to protect some of these places that are of exceptional importance. It's half of our planet. There's a lot to protect, of course. I think what the work that the World Heritage Center NIUCN has been preparing over the last couple of years, I think is pioneering in the sense that it allows us a place to start. I don't think we need to now go into a researching mode for the next 5 years on which sites we're going to protect. If we aren't protecting those that are potentially would be World Heritage on behalf of humanity, what are we going to protect then? So I think it gives us a springboard to perhaps quicker kickstart discussion on actually protecting them rather than looking for another 5 to 10 years which sites we are going to protect. So.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Fanny. That's an optimistic note to end on, I think. I'm sorry we didn't have a bit more time for questions, but with that, I'll hand over to my director, Sébastien Treyer, who will give us a few words in closing. And thank you very much to the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glen, and thanks to all the panelists. This was really, I really enjoyed a lot being able to look at the GBF and BBNG negotiations finally having reached a conclusion, and a positive conclusion, with the GBF and the treaty on BBNJ, and thus being able to look at what we do now. And I think that's really important. One of the key elements of the Global Biodiversity Framework is that we really need to begin implementation very soon. And ocean is one of the key areas where we need to do that. And I think BBNJ is offering a solution to ensure that the targets that are set for the ocean are for the ocean as on land in the GBF are going to be met. I have a few points that are really striking to me. First, and I think that relates a lot to what Jorge was just saying. Implementation is about setting the target, setting the targets like the 30 by 30, doing the national biodiversity strategy and action plans, and these really need to have a weight in political arbitrage on sectoral policies at national, local level, but also at regional level. And I think the focus that was given in this seminar on the regional scale is extremely interesting, because this is where we can see that being sure that we have regional cooperation on biodiversity at sea, but also at land, and regional cooperation on sectoral policies. I'm talking about both fisheries, but also other policies that really can matter for preserving biodiversity in the ocean. This regional level is extremely important if we want to protect marine environments that are never limited to national sovereign boundaries. Even if they are close to the continent, they are not limited by national boundaries. So this is, to me, the regional focus is extremely important, as we have seen, in order to facilitate the capacity to go beyond silos, but also to ensure that, as Jorge was saying, the biodiversity can have more weight in the arbitrage between sectors and between sectors and the environment. Another point that to me is extremely striking is, of course, when we look at the whole GBF, the ocean is very specific. But let's see what we can do with that specificity. few elements that are really striking, but that for all the ocean community are completely obvious. But when you look at it from a point of view where I sit at IDDRI, I'm looking at various sectors and a variety of ecosystems. The ocean is 3D, as we heard. I found that so obvious, but also so interesting, because that matters a lot in the way that we can coordinate between organizations that are responsible for the seabed and those that are responsible for the column. The marine ecosystems are dynamic in space. So how do you manage that? And that, I think, is also very, very interesting. There are always a mixture between sovereign and non-sovereign action. National and regional is therefore very important, and multi-level is extremely important. You also have the problem of being, it seems as if the ocean is more complicated to monitor than other ecosystems, but the team just showed us to what extent we have actually are progressing very rapidly to make the ocean not less monitorable than the rest of the world. And I see also from the presentation by Fanny, the ocean is so much representative of all that we still don't know. The unknown, the reasons why we need to have a precautionary approach to biodiversity in the ocean, and how we can deal with the fact that there are still a lot of things that we don't know, and still we already need to see how we can protect. So my final words would be to say, yes, this is very specific to the ocean. And we need, therefore, a dedicated stream of discussions on what are the tools, the dedicated tools, the dedicated governance mechanisms that are going to enable us to protect the ecosystem. But at the same time, it's also very inspiring for what we can do on other ecosystems. I'm thinking of monitoring, I'm thinking about the precautionary approach, I'm thinking about how we give the good mixture of sovereign and non-sovereign. I believe all this is not just very relevant for the ocean, but also can be an inspiration for the rest of the planet. So these are my words to really thank all the panelists and also the Office Français de la Biodiversité for having co-organized this workshop with IDDRI. It's really, I'm boosted by what I've heard about, yes, we are going to find ways to implement the GBF on land and at sea, and lots of inspiration for the ocean, but also that can help us also find solutions for other places. So big thanks to you all. Thanks for the organizers and the team who has prepared the workshop also. And thanks to the audience for having participated through your questions. I hope to see you soon on another seminar to show how good we have advanced and progressed on the protection of our biodiversity in the ocean. Thank you very much.